Welcome back, everybody. In this episode, I'm going to show you how we went from this to this and every step in between, including milling, drying, selection, planing, design, sanding, gluing, filling, CNC, more CNC, assembly, more sanding, finishing, presentation. We'll plant some trees and conclude with a few moments by the fire pit. If you find this wildly erratic behavior interesting, whether you love it or hate it, subscribe, drill the like button, or leave a comment. In this episode of Morini Furniture, we'll be making the Old West Charcuterie Board, where we'll be starting with milling. Milling is by far the most exhilarating part of the woodworking experience to me. I get to use some extremely powerful equipment, of which really gets the blood pumping. Here in my equipment layout, I have my Husqvarna 3120 XP. Oh yeah, a 36-inch bar. I have my bar oil and premixed fuel, some safety equipment, a chainsaw mill sled assembly. The rail is not of the best quality as the extension slightly bends, but I do like that it has pre-drilled holes to screw in stabilizers. It'll get the job done, but I will likely upgrade to a ladder as it is built more durably. This was a mulberry log, which is a harder wood and was close to 24 inches in diameter. The chainsaw mill might look easy, but it can be a lot of work as opposed to a traditional mill, but it does enable those without the space to actually mill. As you can see, I was able to harvest 3 really nice 4-inch thick slabs that will need an epoxy filler, as well as 2 smaller slabs. Drying, on another note, is not necessarily one of the most interesting parts of the process, as it is much like watching paint dry. But as with anything, you have to make the most of the situation and stay motivated. What I have learned to enjoy about this process is creating a great system, which includes using a laser CNC to engrave the date, the moisture content at that time, the slab number from that cut, as well as the video ID so that I can reference that specific video for a future episode. Now, this smaller slab I obviously did not capture in the milling process, however, was from the same tree. My goal this year was to push out 1 episode every month. However, due to a long planned trip to visit my wife's family in beautiful Finland, I knew I was going to have to build something a bit more manageable. However, as you can tell by the release date of this video, I am already behind this year, so I know I will have to haze myself for this shortfall. I like to use this base for planing, whether it's for my handheld planer or a router sled. As you can see, I am able to drill holes where needed to brace the slab in place, while I eliminate portions of that surface in order to level it perfectly. Some things I like to keep in mind while I'm setting up my router sled is the orientation of the grain of the slab, as there is less rough planing when you respect the grain as opposed to a perpendicular plane. Additionally, I cannot stress enough how much I would encourage dry runs, so to speak, as in passing the slab without power to ensure that you are not planing too much thickness, and also that your stops are set up to ensure that your bit does not nick the edges of that sled. In other words, metal on metal contact, which can obviously be catastrophic. Ultimately, in the shop, there are a few things more satisfying than a level slab and getting there safely. I would argue furniture design requires extensive pre-planning with software that records precise measurements piece by piece. This piece I was working on does not fall in that category, as every now and again I want to make something that I want to make, which I think we can all relate to. There is something therapeutic about being your own boss and improvising from time to time. That being said, the irony of the situation is I was really struggling with which direction I was going to take this piece, as the inspiration simply was not present. I traced out some ideas, but ultimately stifled in progress, so I searched for some muse, which ultimately concluded with our planned trip to Finland. So between work and the shop, this was a much needed exhale. Woodworkers are often shaped by their environment and experiences, and although mine is heavily influenced by the southwest region of the United States, once this woman, who I also refer to as my wife, came into my life, I really had the honor of experiencing one more international culture, of which in turn shapes my work in one way or another from time to time. I will be making an episode in the future from wood I managed to collect native to Finland, so stand by for that as this channel continues to evolve. Overall, the trip was a great time with family, friends, and Finns in general, as well as great food, sauna, snow, ice, snow, and did I mention snow? It was an incredible experience. Snow. Sanding this piece was a little bit of a challenge, as I could use a few more tools to really reach the various shapes of the edges. However, I was able to make do with my orbital sander and some sanding by hand. I don't like to go under 80 grit on the surface of a live edge because I'm more likely to go a little bit deeper with a few stray orbits than I'd like to. Overall, my favorite grit to work with, if I had to choose one, is 120. If you are limited with resources, as many of us are, 120 grit is that sweet spot between the ability to work out the rough spots and progress towards the infant stages of a smooth surface. Currently, I'm working towards adapting my router sled to be used as a power sanding sled to ensure that I'm sanding evenly as opposed to unintentionally sanding one area more than another, which in turn makes the surface uneven and sends one back to square one. And now it's snowing in El Paso. I explained in my last episode that I really try to push the limits of traditional woodworking, and one of the ways I try to push myself is by making my own glue. Making your own glue is really an art form, as you have to get the perfect ratio of adhesion to flexibility. In other words, if it's too hard, it cracks, and if it's too soft, you cannot use it as a filler. It is extremely challenging, and I would not recommend this to the faint of heart. Once I've made my glue, I start filling the various cracks and crevices of my work. Once I fill the various areas with glue, I proceed to scrape off the excess with a nice edge like an old credit card. From there, I like to wipe down any remaining excess glue with a baby wipe, then sprinkle some fine sawdust on top of the glue in an attempt to camouflage the glue a bit more. Fillers generally lose moisture and thus volume as they dry, so you will likely have to repeat the process once, if not twice, unless you are using an epoxy. So I did have to repeat this process twice. Because there is a larger split in this slab, I'm adding bow ties via CNC. Here I'm sizing the exact shape and width of the bow tie that I want, as well as simulating dry runs to ensure everything executes as intended, including adding tabs to ensure that the bow tie isn't entirely cut out, which would be a significant safety concern. Here we begin the CNC of the larger bow tie pocket closest to the edge of the slab with a 1/8 inch end mill bit, of which I cut approximately to 1/2 inch depth, followed by the smaller bow tie pocket and then the CNC of the bow tie inlays. CNC is a fantastic tool, however there are usually some minor touch-ups to attend to reach that desired outcome. Here I am ensuring that the edges of the bow tie that are intended to enter the pocket face down are slightly relieved with an angle to ease insertion, supplemented with some glue to lubricate the edges. And wow, that sentence was loaded. Moving on. Regarding the CNC design and assembly of the bow ties, this was not as hard as it looks, as there is a setting while you're inputting the configurations that allow you to set up the CNC to route inside the shape of my bow tie for the pocket and route on the outside of the shape of the bow tie for the inlay. This creates a flush partnership between the pocket and the inlay. We conclude the bow tie segment with ensuring that the surface of the bow ties is flush with the slab surface, scraping and wiping off excess glue squeezed out in the process. This creates a nice, clean, professional appearance. As the creativity started to come back to me, I decided to give the charcuterie board some life by including some handles. I wanted the handles shaped to the edge of the slab, so I rough traced the shape of the handles and decided I wanted to contrast the slab by making them out of walnut. So after cutting out the stencils, I traced them onto the walnut to get a good feel for what I was envisioning. Sometimes what I envision doesn't always come out the way I had planned, so this is one way I determined that outcome. Again, being heavily influenced by the Southwest, I wanted to add some bucking cowboys to each handle to give it some character as well. We start by rough cutting with a 1/8 inch end mill to get as close to the design as possible so that the finishing bit does not have to work so hard to remove the excess wood to create a fine carving. There are more advanced and more expensive CNCs out there that will actually switch between roughing bits and finishing bits. But at my level, you have to program 2 separate G-codes to run separately and consecutively. So these 2 segments I had to combine because sanding and assembly are not necessarily sequential, as was the case with this project. I started by cutting out the general outline of the handles with my table saw, bandsaw, and miter saw. Once the handles were free, I proceeded to shape the edges to work out the rough spots and shape the corners so that they're not so rigid. This 6-inch belt sander is absolutely amazing. It is about 10 years old, and as you can see, it's quite versatile as far as delivering an end result at a reasonable rate. There was not an extraordinary amount to assemble for this project. Nonetheless, this involves joining the handles to the slab. In an attempt to go as traditional as possible, I wanted to go all wood as opposed to using metals to join the two pieces. I decided to add 1/2-inch dowels to join the handles, of which included drilling into both. After adding some glue, I hammered in the dowels, let them dry, and proceeded to join the handles to the slab. I'm a fan of really snug joinery. However, these dowels were cut from a rod that, unlike pre-made dowels, has a flush surface. So generally with dowels, I like to use a drill bit slightly smaller than the diameter of the dowel, but in this case I went with a 1/2-inch bit to match the 1/2-inch dowel because there's not as much of a surplus of space. I did notice a blemish on one of the handles that I had to make a quick fix for with careful and fine gluing. I was careful not to chip off the splinter while adding minimal glue so that I did not discolor this area of the handle. Also, I did not like the shape of the right handle, so I improvised and rounded it off a bit more. Once the tip was removed, I went ahead and sanded it off. However, I still did not like the look of these and decided to round off the surface of each handle significantly more. As I am finishing my project, I really have to maintain my patience. Finishing, in my experience, requires at least 3 rounds of attention. I like to apply my finish, let it dry, sand with 2000 grit, repeat that process once, and then in my final round use 10,000 grit. As crazy as that sounds, I love 10,000 grit as it does not scuff any of the finish but eliminates those micro blemishes and leaves an incredibly smooth surface. Look at this, we finally made it. I am extremely happy with the way this project turned out. I like that I was able to preserve the yellow hue of the mulberry while contrasting the walnut handles, which gives it a nice touch. The bow ties add a sense of sophistication as it involves some higher levels of woodworking artistry and also adds some nice contrast. The burl of the slab really gets highlighted on the surface while being accented with the natural and wavy white border. This was another great experience in the shop. As always, I learned something new as I continue to push my limits. All in all, this was another great project I had the pleasure of working on from log to end result, which is really the direction I would like to take my work, as I do believe the work is appreciated more and not so easily discarded. One of the things I try to do on a regular basis is to be grateful for what I have and give back in some way, shape, or form. So in this episode, I attempted to plant some tree seedlings. I will keep you posted on how this goes in the next episode. And as promised, here's a few moments by the fire pit. Again, if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe, like, dislike, love it or hate it, leave a comment. Until next month, we'll see you then.